Hello there and welcome. Tonight, we're setting sail, not on a stormy sea filled with battles and cannons, but on a calm, peaceful voyage through history. Pirates have captured our imaginations for centuries, with their mysterious lives, hidden treasures, and adventures on the open ocean. But instead of loud legends and scary tales, tonight, we'll explore quieter truths, gentle pirate facts, perfect for drifting off to sleep. So find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, and let the soft waves of history carry you toward rest. Piracy often began with the simple question, why would a sailor abandon his ship and choose a life branded as crime? The answer was rarely treasure alone. It was not just greed. It was a quiet hunger for dignity, for choice, and for fair shares. On pirate ships, even if danger walked beside them, men could vote for their captains and claim equal portions of what was taken. That contrast mattered more than gold. For most sailors, the push toward piracy came from deep fatigue and discontent. Imagine the 18th century naval deck. The air is sharp with salt, the work unending. Orders are barked, never asked. Pay is promised, but withheld. Food is scarce and often spoiled, and always present is the weight of punishment. One mistake could mean a lash that cuts the skin raw. This was not rare, but routine. Under such conditions, the idea of crossing to a pirate crew began to look less like betrayal and more like freedom. Historians estimate desertion was common. By some accounts, nearly a sixth of British seamen deserted each year in the early 1700s. Numbers like this show that leaving was not unusual weakness, but a choice hundreds were willing to make. Life on merchant ships rarely offered relief. A man hauled ropes or tended sails for wages that could vanish in an instant at the whim of an owner. Cargo mattered more than crew. Weeks turned into months without sight of land. Sleep was broken, hammocks were damp, and bread turned stale long before it fed. Many had signed up with dreams of adventure or honest earnings, but each voyage revealed something colder, a trade of youth for hardship with no promise of care in return. Stories of pirates drifting across the sea grew less like warnings. They became whispers of escape. When a black flag rose and gunfire echoed, the choice came alive. Some sailors chose death over draft. Others, when invited, simply stepped across and never looked back. But was piracy truly freedom, or simply another kind of prison? That was the wager. To sign on as a pirate meant standing against the crown. Capture almost promised a hanging. Battles cut men down, sickness ravaged bodies, and hunger twisted the gut. Yet even with such risks, the chance to escape strict command was strong. For many, it was not about prolonging life. It was about reclaiming it, however briefly. A man beaten for sport could find no justice aboard a naval vessel. But if another dark ship offered him a place and a vote, it was more than defiance. It was the first act of belonging. This was not the fantasy of villains chasing only gold, as stories often suggest. More often, these were runaways from misery. Some had been dragged unwilling into service, pressed into naval duty they never chose. Others buried friends who had died from punishments or starvation under command. They were not running toward fortune, but away from emptiness. One common pattern held. Men forced into naval service who, at first chance, deserted and joined the very enemies they were ordered to fight. That was no accident. It was a choice carved out of desperation. Piracy, for all its violence, surprised many with its fairness. This is not to say comfort was found there. Hard work, poor food, and sleepless nights continued. But pirate codes gave men a voice. Loot was divided by share. Leaders were chosen, not imposed. Decisions required agreement, not just command. For men used to silence, this was a form of recognition. A man mattered, even if only while the black flag flew. This whisper of equality was often enough to risk the gallows. Still, no one believed the pirate deck was soft. Food was no better. Disease spread just as fast, and space was just as cramped. Hunger remained a steady companion. Yet men accepted these burdens differently when they were born together. Choice carried its own weight of comfort. Even a short life under shared rule felt worth more than an endless one bent under orders. Survival did not change, but the way they were seen did. And for many that shift gave more strength than food or coin ever could. At its core, the decision was a crossroads. On one side, safety framed by cruelty, naval drudgery with its lash, stale meals, and no chance for advancement. On the other side, equal risk, starvation, capture, death, but also equal say, however fragile. Faced with two harsh roads, many chose the one that carried a promise of fairness. Survival was never guaranteed, but meaning, even for a season, could still be found. The price was high, always. To live with freedom on a pirate deck meant living on the edge of death. Every man who crossed the line knew this. Battles with patrols, storms that shattered masts, illness with no cure, all were common. Yet those who chose saw dignity returned. For once, a man's voice counted. That small glimpse of humanity was a prize as rare as coin. Men often said that though death came faster, it came under lines they themselves accepted. And that was enough. Think of the image we carry of pirates. The roaring flags, the reckless charges, gold spilling from stolen chests. It all suggests a thirst for riches and glory. Yet behind the smoke lay quieter truths. These were men with empty pockets and bitter memories. Hunger, cruelty, despair, all pushed them to gamble everything. Their black flag was not only terror to others, it was a fragile banner of choice to themselves. The shift was not about comfort, but difference. For the first time, a seaman could stand where his voice was counted. His portion, small as it was, stood equal with his comrades. His captain was strong, but bound by votes. In this, there was no illusion of gentleness, only recognition of fairness. To live briefly as an equal was better than to drag on indefinitely as less than nothing. So when we think of what drew men to piracy, it was not always gold. Far more often, it was the search for dignity. It was the promise, however short-lived, of belonging to a crew that shared voice and burden alike. That choice lit hope among the poor and the punished. Even with death close at hand, men stepped into it willingly. Still, what they found was never ease. Piracy gave recognition to overlooked men, but the sea gave nothing freely. Once aboard, daily survival proved as punishing as before. Labor was constant. Quarters were close. Illness bred in every corner. Relief came rarely through food, which was often as foul as that left behind. And here, the bitter truth returned. Though men held a vote, their meals carried the same rot and misery. It is there our attention now turns, to what kept them alive and what brought them closer to ruin with every mouthful. Imagine holding a piece of bread so dry it cracks in your hand, and so infested with insects it seems to wriggle in the dim lantern light. This was not unusual food at sea. For pirates, meals were never about pleasure. They were about enduring hunger one bite at a time, no matter what lived inside the bread. A sailor might tap the biscuit on the table, shake loose a few weevils, and then, with no waste allowed, chew whatever remained. These biscuits, called hardtack, were baked to last for months. They were hard enough to break teeth. Over time, the sea's damp air transformed them into a refuge for mold and crawling life. Salt meat filled the other half of the diet. Barrels of pork or beef swimming in brine until the flavor was more salt than flesh. Often stringy, sometimes green, it still went into hungry mouths. Men chewed because hunger gave no choice. Water brought no comfort either. Stored in barrels for weeks, it turned sour and thick. Dark strands floated beneath the surface. The smell was foul, but thirst was stronger. Cups of weak beer or rum replaced it when they had some, not for pleasure, but simply because it was safer to drink. Small gatherings formed in silence, men sipping slowly, each gulp chasing down rotten bread or salted shreds of meat. Eating was never free of fear. Food and drink healed nothing. Often they poisoned. Insects and mold from biscuits twisted stomachs. Meat carried rot and fever. Foul water led to cramps and weakness. Every bite was a gamble. You might fill your belly, or you might plant the seed of sickness that would rise days later in sweat and pain. Of all the dangers, scurvy lingered as the most terrifying. Fresh fruit and vegetables were absent, and bodies weakened in terrible ways. Gums bled and swelled. Teeth loosened until they dropped away. Skin bruised with the lightest touch. Joints stiffened. The illness was slow and merciless, a wasting that robbed men of strength in silence. Accounts from the time describe men whose gums bled and whose joints seized, a slow and brutal decline that crews dreaded more than battle itself. Diarrhea, fever, dizzy spells from spoiled food or foul water, these too spread quickly. There were no cures, no medicines. Rest was the only hope, yet hammocks were crowded, duties constant, and room to recover non-existent. One bad barrel could weaken half the ship, and a vessel stripped of strength drifted helpless against currents and storms. In this way, food was both lifeline and curse. At sea too long without prize ships or shore, supplies vanished. Scraps of biscuit were treasured, each one broken and counted. Water casks were tilted and found nearly empty. Salt meat barrels stank even when hollow. During these stretches, men's minds did not drift toward treasure. They longed for bread, for clear water, for something green to chew, even a single fruit to remind their bodies of what they once knew. Pirates ate little better than the sailors they deserted from. If anything, their risk of scarcity was worse. The difference, however, was equality. On naval ships, officers dined differently, while the rest survived on what was left. On pirate ships, there was no such divide. A foul biscuit divided fairly was still foul, yet it carried the hard comfort of fairness. Every man shared the same misery in equal measure. Picture the crew together after days at sea, circles of men chewing in silence, the tap of sailcloth moving above, the faint scrape of teeth against dry bread. Perhaps a joke was made about the insects. Extra meat, someone might mutter. For a fleeting second, laughter rose. Just as quickly, it faded. Because the meal remained the same, food gave life, but its cruelty was constant, every chew a reminder of what was absent: fresh bread, clean water, wholesome meat. Day by day, pirates adjusted until memory of better meals dulled away. They ate not to feel satisfied, but because the body demanded it. The sea outside offered endless promise. Inside, the men tasted only staleness and decay. Raids reflected this truth. Yes, gold shone brightly, but when a ship was captured, provisions were the first prize. Barrels of clear water, dry bread less blackened by mold, stores of vegetables, any fruit at all. Pirates lunged for these with more urgency than they did for coins or jewels. Silver could not feed them. Gems could not still hunger. What mattered most was the chance to eat without gagging. Food shaped not just bodies but tempers. Hunger made short fuses. Arguments flared over whether someone had taken too much or stored their ration carelessly. At the same time, meals reminded the crew of fragile unity. Nobody ate better than another. A strip of stringy pork, a crumb of bread, a cloudy sip of water, these were all shared. In this shared deprivation, they found a kind of equality no other ship gave them. Imagine yourself seated at their table, your lips cracked from thirst, your teeth aching as you try to bite through a biscuit alive with small creatures, the smell of salted pork heavy and sour in the air. You chew because you must. You swallow though your stomach shudders. Tomorrow the same. Forgetting that food once filled with sweetness, you come to expect only this. Endurance crept into daily life. Small tricks helped men carry on, scraping away mold, shaking insects loose, dividing rations into smaller portions to make hunger wait. Others distracted themselves with quick tales or soft songs, voices low while chewing, not joy, but survival. A rhythm of discomfort that still marked the passage of days. So many stories speak of pirate feasts, of rum and roasted plenty. Yet the truth was harsher. Their real banquet was worm-filled bread and briny meat. Their real celebration came when a captured vessel provided foods that modern tables would find ordinary, but to them were treasures. A bag of flour, a sack of seeds, a barrel of fruit that could hold back the knife of scurvy. Even large hauls of riches often slipped away fast. One captain lost a massive fortune in just a few years of drink and gambling, while a fresh loaf of bread was cheered as priceless. Treasure glittered, but food sustained, however poorly. When men spoke of requirements, they named bread, then water. Only after that came gold and silver. Meals mattered most because without them, nothing else could be dreamed of. This truth marked each passing day. Every swallow equalized them. Each man chewing noisily around the same fire, swallowing the same bitterness. Their strength faded alike. Their stomachs grumbled alike. For all their daring freedom, their diet dragged them back to a humbler truth. Survival meant living on food even vermin might spit out. And as the light dimmed each day, the ritual ended the same. Dishes scraped clean, cups set aside, the men's bellies swollen with sickness or left aching and empty. They laid themselves down in the close blackness below. There the food weighed on them, twisting in their insides, sour breath heavy in stale air. What they faced in sleep was no easier than what they ate awake. The next hardship waited not on the table, but where they put their heads to rest. It crept in the dark as surely as hunger did by day. Picture yourself so tired that your body sinks heavy. Yet when you stretch into your hammock, the coarse canvas brushes against your skin, and something small shifts beside you. a rat searching the dark, the faint tickle of lice in your hair, the slow scrape of cockroaches moving along damp wooden beams. This was what welcomed pirates when their work ended. Sleep did not mean comfort here. Everywhere the air carried heat, dampness, and the movement of creatures that belonged to no one but themselves. Hammocks were strung side by side in the ship's belly. Rows of canvas slings hung so close that men touched shoulders and hips as they lay. On gun decks, the ceiling hovered just a few feet above, low enough that no one could sit upright. Hammocks stretched only inches apart from heavy cannon. The wood never felt dry. Salt spray seeped into beams and storms pushed dampness into every seam. Clothes and bedding clung to the skin, sticky with sweat and mildew. The air settled heavy, carrying breath, heat, and the sour odor of food stowed below. To lie down meant surrendering to that closeness. Privacy simply did not exist. Men rested pressed together, their movement restless against one another. Snores filled every corner. Coughs carried quickly and never stayed with only one man. Once sickness took hold, it spread easily in the shared air. Dysentery, fevers, even yellowed illness from stagnant water traveled through the rows, carried hammock to hammock by vermin as much as body heat. The lower deck became more than a place of restless sleep. It was an easy path for disease. Every so often, the dead lay there too. Burial at sea did not always come swiftly. Corpses sometimes remained until time or ritual allowed them into the water, so the living closed their eyes only steps from decay. The mind often pretended not to notice, but deep inside, every man knew. There was no barrier between health and harm when death lingered so close. Still, bodies slumped into hammocks because exhaustion cut through such unease, forcing rest where none should come. Night heat pressed down hardest of all. Lamps burned low until their smoke mixed with damp, muggy air. Sweat collected at the neck, pooled in the bend of skin, and cloth already wet from rain never dried against flesh. In colder times, storms brought less heat but no relief, dripping icy lines from overhead beams, chilling clothes already soaked. Sleep meant lying in an oven 1 week and a dripping cave the next. Men shifted endlessly, not searching for comfort, but for any small place their bodies might endure a few stolen hours. Pirate ships often carried more men than space allowed. Hammocks lined every beam, and when the canvas ran out, the floor itself became bedding. Some curled near cannons, others rested among barrels or rope. Rats found them in both places alike, gnawing at scraps and scurrying boldly across still limbs. Lice bred easily in seams, while fleas jumped without pause from fabric to skin. There was no escape. Every man carried these creatures as surely as clothing. The damp air affected lungs as deeply as the skin. Rope dust, mildew, and the close press of bodies filled each breath. Wheezing became common, coughs deepened, and fevers never quite faded. At night, the chorus of breathing often turned into rough gasps beside snores. Men tried to rest, but in doing so gave illness chance to grow stronger, passing easily in that shared space. It was quieter than a battle, but in its slow reach, it took just as much strength. Each man tolerated sleep because he had no choice. The day's labor stripped the body so bare of energy that the brain surrendered without resistance. Hammocks might drip with rain or crawl with vermin, but still men closed their eyes. They did not sleep because they wished to. They slept because their bodies demanded it. By morning the cycle began again, already forgetting how poor the night had been. Imagine lying in that kind of stillness. Your hammock sways faintly, ropes creak with the ship's slow rocking. You itch under your shirt and against your scalp. A rat crosses your hand in the near dark, its body heavier than you expect. Exhaustion makes you brush it away without opening your eyes. At the start, moments like that may jolt you awake. With time, they become background, as familiar as the sea itself. The ship moves with rats, as it does with lice and fleas, and so do you. Relief, when it came, was narrow. Hammocks might be carried onto the deck for airing, though salty spray soon stiffened the fabric and hardened it against the skin. Fingers picked through seams, pulling lice one by one, only to feel them return the next day. Rats, too plentiful to fight, were sometimes eaten when hunger grew severe. But none of these efforts lasted. Vermin were part of the ship, settled in too deep to drive away. What troubled men most, however, was not the scratching and crawling. It was what followed. One body sickened, another weakened in the night. Fevers cut hard through muscles. Open wounds, never clean in damp air, turned quickly to infection. Lice carried illness easily from hammock to hammock. To lie down here meant not only sleepless irritation, but risk that your body would wake fevered or aching, too weak to work, too vulnerable to fight. Yet no man could refuse rest. The endless labor of the ship demanded collapse come night. Resistance gained nothing. You lay down because not lying down was impossible. Darkness met you not with comfort, but exhaustion so thick it pulled your lids closed. What you gained was shallow, uneven, waking as often to scratching as to coughing, but it was enough to return to work next morning. Consider what strength the body finds in such places. To sleep where every breath tastes sour, where pests move across your skin, where fever waits beside you, and still to rise and climb ropes at dawn, it says much about necessity. Rest did not cure or soothe, but it returned just enough strength to carry out the next day. That was all the night allowed. The pirate's sleep was never quiet. Rats thumped and scratched in corners. Lice worked silently in cloth. Sneezes and coughs cracked the silence, and hushed voices whispered to them in the dark. Each morning, hammocks swung empty, as if the night had left nothing behind. Men rose, shoulders stiff, skin itching, eyes dark with weariness, and they moved again, as if such nights were already forgotten. This was the side of piracy unseen in songs and tales. The dark hours endured with no glory, only fatigue. Night after night, hammocks rocked, bodies pressed close, vermin creeping unseen. Here rest was not about comfort, but about necessity. Not leisure, but brief surrender to exhaustion. As dawn came, men pulled themselves out of the dark air, knowing the day ahead carried demands just as relentless. And what awaited them above deck was not softer. For the pirate, nights tested what the body could endure. But the daylight brought something harsher still. Work that stretched from gray dawn to black night, leaving no margin for peace. When daylight reached the deck, it brought with it not relief, but labor without pause. Endless toil was the fabric of a pirate's life, hours chained together by work that began the moment they stood from their hammocks and did not ease until the ship fell back into darkness. The ship itself demanded it. To keep any vessel moving at sea required constant hands. The sails had to bend and shift with every change of wind, Ropes tightened and untangled, canvas stitched when it tore. Men climbed high into rigging slick with spray, gripping wood and rope, while storms shook the masts beneath them. Strength was not optional, it was survival. Even the hull below was part of the burden. Crews sometimes hauled ships ashore to scrape away barnacles from the planks, a filthy and grueling task known as careening. Each chore seemed ordinary, yet each weighed heavily, repeated endlessly until their bodies learned the rhythm through exhaustion. On deck, the duties multiplied. Salt water sprayed through storms and waves, pooling until men worked on knees and hands with brushes and buckets, scouring away salt before it could ruin the wood. The smell of brine never faded. Cannons sat waiting, gathering grime when not in use, while powder dust from past fights pressed into crevices. So even in calm waters, the ship gave no peace. Feel the slow, patient rhythm of a day that never ends, scrubbing, hauling, stitching, scraping, tasks without flourish, only necessity. This order could stretch itself into silence for days. The sea might show no ships, only horizon unbroken by sails. Yet still, there was work. Weapons had to be cared for, guns polished against rust, muskets checked and oiled. Cannon barrels were dragged inch by inch to be inspected, then heaved back into place. Planks splintered and had to be repaired, ropes soaked and frayed needed splicing. These were not moments of adventure, just steady strain. It was this routine, more than battle, that shaped the pirate's body into something hardened, not with glamour, but familiarity with pain. And then, without warning, all of that monotony could snap. One moment, men bent low with brushes or sat stitching canvas. The next, a distant shape appeared on the water. Sails meant preparation, and preparation meant urgency. Cannons rolled into line. Powder kegs cracked open. Decks cleared of clutter. The same hands that had scrubbed filth 1 hour were now loading weapons the next. Exhausted bodies rushed to stations, fighting not with fresh energy, but with muscles already battered by ceaseless labor. The sudden flip from dull routine to battle carried its own dread, reducing rest into nothing more than a faint hope. In battle or without it, men carried scars from the workload. Rope laid welts into palms, canvas split skin, and heavy barrels pulled at backs until spines stiffened permanently. Faces burned from sun, chests thick from climbing, every movement branded by repetition. It was never training alone that made them resilient. It was simply the grind. Pirates grew into their roles because the ship left them no other shape to take. What looked like strength was born from the narrowest purpose, survival. Even quiet seas, days where nothing came but sun and rolling waves, pressed with danger. When tempers burned low from hunger or fatigue, quarrels might spark from small mistakes. One man holding too loosely to a rope, another failing to patch quick enough. Mistakes at sea were serious. A loose knot could wreak havoc. Broken rigging could snap and kill outright. An overloaded cannon could shatter. Wounded men placed greater burdens on the crew left standing, pulling all others deeper into the grind. Not just in combat, but in ordinary hours, the work itself struck like an enemy waiting in each task. That endless repetition carried with it a strange rhythm. Like the tide, duty swept them up, line after line, job after job. Midday blurred into night, rope into weapon, climb into cleaning. Some days, men spoke quietly while they worked, jokes half formed out of exhaustion. Other days, silence weighed heavy across the crew. The sameness gave way to monotony, yet inside this sameness lay endurance. What the sea demanded of them, they endured, because they had no choice. How order held under such strain became the deeper question. Without command, the tug of weariness might have torn the crew apart. Hunger combined with exhaustion can make tempers dangerous, and yet pirates stood shoulder to shoulder through every repeated chore. It was not luck. A fragile but binding order kept them moving together. That order lived not in the threat of punishment from a master, but in agreements they themselves had built. The repetition built strength beyond muscle. With each rope pulled, men learned to ignore blisters. With each climb into the mast, they trained themselves to trust their grip, no matter how slick the wood. With each scrubbed plank, bent spine, and coil of rope, their bodies were hardened into endurance most could not imagine. They did not grow used to pain, it never vanished, but they adjusted to living inside it. By doing so, a rhythm of survival carried them forward across days and weeks, pressing them through a kind of life that few would choose but all had to bear. Such details rarely enter legend. Stories tell of battle, gunfire, plunder, and dramatic victory. Rarely do they tell of men bent over boards, dragging brushes soaked with spray and sweat. Yet the truth is this: most lives at sea were measured not in daring battles, but in routine drudgery. Hours upon hours of invisible effort filled the long quiet between the rare flashes of combat that came. This is where pirates truly lived. Inside the chores, no tales tried to remember. Violence was a page, but repetition was the book. Even so, monotony itself threatened as much as combat. A drifting mind, dulled by heat and endless sameness, loosened knots or misjudged a rope's strain. Accidents multiplied under the weight of exhaustion. The balance of dozens of men working together could tilt from one small lapse, and when it did, every hand had to pull harder to keep the ship upright. The labor was not personal, it was collective. Missing even a single set of shoulders strained all others in turn. And so the toil reveals its hidden answer. These crews held together not because of luck, and not because of cruelty alone. The work could not be survived without structure, shared rules, shared understanding, and above all, shared duty. Each man bent into his part not under pure force, but under a system all agreed upon. Without that, fatigue would have scattered them into violence long before any enemy cannonball. Picture them now, tired men bent across deck and mast, their bodies worn and breath short, yet still pressing forward to hold together a life most would never accept ashore. The real strength was not in daring, but in their willingness to bind themselves together through endless necessity. That fragile order carried them not just through battle, but through all the overlooked hours of work. It made survival possible where otherwise chaos should have taken them. And while many think of pirates as creatures of lawlessness, the truth settled deeper. Even among thieves, there existed a structure, chosen and enforced, that guided each day of labor. What that meant and how it worked will become clear in what you hear next. It may sound unexpected, but beneath their rough image, pirate crews lived by rules as strict as any workplace today. They were not men acting without restraint. Their lives rested on agreements known as the pirate code, These codes were not spoken casually. They were written out, signed by every man, and treated as binding contracts. Each signature, or mark for those who could not write, marked a choice: to live under shared rules. For men who had once bent under the lash of naval captains, this sense of fairness was not kindness. It was survival. You can imagine a sheet of paper, worn from damp hands and salt spray, passed slowly from one sailor to another. Each man agreed to limits that defined food, duties, treasure, and punishment. Some codes survive today. Bartholomew Roberts' articles, for instance, were copied down and divided prizes into shares, setting aside extra sums for men who had lost limbs in battle. Rules like these reminded each sailor that the danger he faced was balanced by certainty once the fighting ended. A lost hand or a shattered leg would not leave him abandoned. Instead, the code promised compensation, one more detail woven into survival. These articles also spoke firmly about weapons. Pistols, blades, and cannon were tools of life and death, and neglect was not tolerated. A gun that failed at the wrong moment put every man at risk. So rules commanded them to keep weapons clean and in order. That duty extended beyond the individual. If one man's pistol misfired, a brother beside him might die. In this way, order stretched its grip through each hand aboard. The code also gave men a voice. Captains were not masters by right. They were elected, chosen by those they commanded. If courage faltered, if greed grew too heavy, or if misjudgment lingered too long, the same vote could end a captain's command and place another in his stead. Quartermasters often shared power, guarding supplies and discipline, so no single man ruled unchecked. Within this fragile democracy, the smallest voice still weighed against the strongest, anchoring fairness in decisions both minor and great. Why did pirates, men-marked criminals on land, build such structures on their ships? The answer comes not from ideals, but from necessity. Without rules, greed would eat away trust. The strongest might seize more food, claim greater riches, or drink freely while others watched in hunger. Resentment would rise, loyalty would crack, and soon the deck would become more dangerous than any enemy ship. By choosing shared law, they built protections not for justice alone, but because survival could not continue in chaos. Imagine this unity before a battle. Men stood lined across the deck, weapons sharp, sails trimmed, and cannons loaded. Each sailor knew his share was protected by his signature, and that his risks were measured equally with his brothers. Gold and goods would not slip away into the captain's purse. Injury would not mean starvation. In certainty, the courage to fight as one found its roots. Articles stretched their reach also into ordinary days. Some forbade gambling while at sea, for fear that ill luck would spill into disputes. Musicians, when present, were named to play during long, slow days of flat calm, their notes easing monotony. Specific penalties spelled out theft, desertion, or neglect. Hammock space, supplies, and even fire risk in lanterns could find their place in writing. Many crews lived pressed together under endless hardship. Written clarity spared them from unnecessary conflict. Taken together, this order revealed a paradox. These men struck fear along coasts, defied monarchs, and robbed merchants on open seas. Yet in their own ranks, equality bound them more tightly than laws ashore. Your vote matched any man's, rich or poor, skilled or unskilled. Your pay share was written and certain. If a leader failed you, he could be removed. These measures did not make life soft, but against hunger, disease, and ceaseless work. They kept the fragile peace that bound separate bodies into a single crew. Picture marking your name beside such rules. You left the Navy for its cruelty. You risked death to grasp freedom. Yet here you bind yourself again, not under a master, but beside equals. The rules hold punishments as well as promises. They limit your actions, even when no captain stands watching. Some freedoms must bend so others can endure. In that signing, freedom shifts from personal will into collective survival. Stories often describe pirates sneering at law, mocking order when they reached shore. On shipboard, though, they lived under their own discipline. Fairness mattered not because they desired justice, but because without it, hunger and greed tore men apart. Their rulebook became invisible armor against division. It gave them confidence in battle, quieted quarrels below deck, and stilled doubt when rewards were shared. By choice, they lived within its boundaries. By necessity, they depended on those limits. Yet, like all boundaries, written fairness brought weight with it. The articles defined more than unity. They demanded consequence. Order had no value if breaking it brought no price. And so, alongside shares and votes, each man read the penalties awaiting betrayal, theft, or disobedience. Survival asked for this too, a warning sharp enough that even desperate men paused before stepping astray. Rules sustained them, but rules also bound them to judgment. It was one thing to sign your mark to fair shares and chosen leadership. It was another to face the punishments promised in the same ink. That balance, the order and the fear it carried, shaped what came next. Punishment and fear were as much a part of pirate life as sails and ropes. Order depended on it. When rules were broken, consequences rose swiftly and with weight, for without clear penalties, their fragile fairness could easily unravel. One of the most common penalties was flogging. A man might be tied to a mast, his back exposed, and whipped in front of the crew. It was painful, and the point was less about the lash itself than about the reminder it carried. The code was not a suggestion. Every sailor watching understood that the same discipline could one day fall on him. The sting faded, but the memory stayed sharp, a quiet warning built into the fabric of daily life. Other times, punishment reached further. Marooning haunted many men, more feared than flogging ever could. This meant leaving someone behind on a barren shore, with only a small supply, often a pistol, a little powder, some water, and little else. Enough to last a short while, but not enough to survive. It was a punishment so cold it echoed louder than the victim's fate, because it carried the message of being cut off forever. Some crews truly carried this out. One recorded case tells of 2 offenders left behind with almost no chance of rescue. Such punishments were rare, but their possibility was enough to sober the boldest man's thoughts. Death, too, stood among the consequences. A man found guilty of betrayal, murder, or trying to stir mutiny could be executed. Sometimes it was shot cleanly, other times by hanging. While pirates lived beyond the king's laws, on their own decks, law still had a final edge. No voice or plea outweighed it. Discipline was not arbitrary. It was directly bound by the rules they all agreed upon, and that gave even the hardest punishments a certain grim fairness. In different accounts, punishments ranged widely, from flogging to marooning, And in rarer or debated stories, even practices like keel hauling. Historians argue whether those extreme measures were ever truly common, but the very mention carried weight. Men believed in the possibility, whether they had witnessed it or not, and belief alone was enough to shape behavior. It might seem strange that men who voted for their leaders and shared their treasure also accepted sentences so harsh. Yet their democracy was not built for comfort, but for survival. Fair shares held them together, but hunger, sickness, and hardship tested every bond. Without discipline, frustration and greed could fracture the crew. Punishments kept that from happening, enforcing unity in a place where one loose thread could tear apart the whole cloth. Picture yourself, a sailor weighing temptation. You know your share is guaranteed, yet the thought tempts you. A small coin hidden away, a little more than your due. But the memory of a man whipped, or the silence after one was marooned, moves through your mind. Immediately, your hands fall still. The risk is greater than the gain. In that instant, fear proves more binding than the promise of fairness alone. This balance, shared choices held steady by harsh obedience, defined life at sea. The men trusted their system not because it was gentle, but because it was consistent. They knew what would happen if trust was broken. Unlike on Navy vessels, where officers might punish on a whim, pirate rules were clear before a voyage began. Certainty itself became a kind of peace. Each man lived with discipline, knowing exactly where the boundaries lay. Fear, for all its coldness, often held the crew tighter than simple loyalty could. It pulled men together, reminded them that they were strongest only when united. Watching a punishment carried out did not destroy morale. It reinforced the truth that safety depended on trust, and trust was worthless if betrayal went unchallenged. Fear linked men, silently reinforcing each order, each shared watch on deck, each moment of crisis. Some punishments grew into symbols that lasted long beyond the act itself. A man once marooned became a story told for years, his absence heavy in every whispered tale. The lash scars on another's back told their own quiet story whenever salt water stung them. These reminders traveled farther than one event. They became part of the crew's collective memory, invisible but always present. What seems harsh in distance, for them became practical. They endured brutal penalties, not because they loved severity, but because without them, survival would fail. Unity was both chosen and enforced. Fear ensured it held. For the pirates, pain was not opposite to freedom. It was the shadow that made their small measure of fairness possible at all. Punishment and fear were as much a part of pirate life as sails and ropes. Order depended on it. When rules were broken, consequences rose swiftly and with weight, for without clear penalties, their fragile fairness could easily unravel. One of the most common penalties was flogging. A man might be tied to a mast, his back exposed, and whipped in front of the crew. It was painful, and the point was less about the lash itself than about the reminder it carried. The code was not a suggestion. Every sailor watching understood that the same discipline could one day fall on him. The sting faded, but the memory stayed sharp, a quiet warning built into the fabric of daily life. Other times, punishment reached further. Marooning haunted many men, more feared than flogging ever could. This meant leaving someone behind on a barren shore with only a small supply, often a pistol, a little powder, some water, and little else. Enough to last a short while, but not enough to survive. It was a punishment so cold it echoed louder than the victim's fate, because it carried the message of being cut off forever. Some crews truly carried this out. One recorded case tells of two offenders left behind with almost no chance of rescue. Such punishments were rare, but their possibility was enough to sober the boldest man's thoughts. Death, too, stood among the consequences. A man found guilty of betrayal, murder, or trying to stir mutiny could be executed. Sometimes it was shot cleanly, other times by hanging. While pirates lived beyond the king's laws, on their own decks, law still had a final edge. No voice or plea outweighed it. Discipline was not arbitrary. It was directly bound by the rules they all agreed upon, and that gave even the hardest punishments a certain grim fairness. In different accounts, punishments ranged widely, from flogging to marooning, and in rarer or debated stories, even practices like keel hauling. Historians argue whether those extreme measures were ever truly common, but the very mention carried weight. Men believed in the possibility, whether they had witnessed it or not, and belief alone was enough to shape behavior. It might seem strange that men who voted for their leaders and shared their treasure also accepted sentences so harsh. Yet their democracy was not built for comfort, but for survival. Fair shares held them together, but hunger, sickness, and hardship tested every bond. Without discipline, frustration and greed could fracture the crew. Punishments kept that from happening, enforcing unity in a place where one loose thread could tear apart the whole cloth. Picture yourself, a sailor weighing temptation. You know your share is guaranteed, yet the thought tempts you. A small coin hidden away, a little more than your due. But the memory of a man whipped, or the silence after one was marooned, moves through your mind. Immediately your hands fall still. The risk is greater than the gain. In that instant, fear proves more binding than the promise of fairness alone. This balance, shared choices held steady by harsh obedience, defined life at sea. The men trusted their system not because it was gentle, but because it was consistent. They knew what would happen if trust was broken. Unlike on Navy vessels, where officers might punish on a whim, pirate rules were clear before a voyage began. Certainty itself became a kind of peace. Each man lived with discipline, knowing exactly where the boundaries lay. Fear, for all its coldness, often held the crew tighter than simple loyalty could. It pulled men together, reminded them that they were strongest only when united. Watching a punishment carried out did not destroy morale. It reinforced the truth that safety depended on trust, and trust was worthless if betrayal went unchallenged. Fear linked men, silently reinforcing each order, each shared watch on deck, each moment of crisis. Some punishments grew into symbols that lasted long beyond the act itself. A man once marooned became a story told for years, his absence heavy in every whispered tale. The lash scars on another's back told their own quiet story whenever salt water stung them. These reminders traveled farther than one event. They became part of the crew's collective memory, invisible but always present. What seems harsh in distance, for them became practical. They endured brutal penalties not because they loved severity, but because without them, survival would fail. Unity was both chosen and enforced. Fear ensured it held. For the pirates, pain was not opposite to freedom. It was the shadow that made their small measure of fairness possible at all. Battles for survival were at the heart of pirate life. When a new sail appeared on the horizon, men knew that everything rested on how the next few moments played out. What pirates wanted most might surprise you. It was not glittering treasure or buried chests, but food to eat, water to drink, and supplies to keep their ship moving. Riches, when they appeared, mattered only if they could be spent quickly or traded for the things that kept men alive. A pirate attack often ended before it even began, because fear itself did the work. To the crew of a merchant ship, the black flag carried more dread than cannon fire. That dark banner, raised against the sky, bore a clear promise: surrender now or face death. Panic ran through crews who had little experience of combat, making their defense collapse before the first shot. For pirates, battles were not fought only with weapons. They were fought in the minds of those looking across the sea at a flag no one wished to challenge. Intimidation was their sharpest weapon. Black flags snapped in the wind, warning all who saw them that mercy would be thin. A single cannon might be fired, not to sink the target, but to thunder across the waves. The sound rippled through sailors' nerves, a warning shot that sent hearts racing. Smoke curled into the air, painting a vision of battle before it began. Already the stronger tool was working. Hopelessness. And often it was enough. If resistance flickered, boarding came fast. Pirates moved like a tide, swarming decks, howling to break the spirit of those who tried to stand against them. Trained through constant work, hardened by labor, and used to violence, they overwhelmed crews unaccustomed to combat. Merchant sailors were not warriors. They were men used to ropes and sails, not blades and guns. Facing an enemy practiced in seizing ships, most realized quickly that fighting on would only bring slaughter. Fear thinned courage faster than wounds. Some pirates layered spectacle onto terror. Blackbeard, the most infamous of all, shaped his very presence into a weapon. Blackbeard sometimes tied slow-burning fuses into his beard to frighten opponents. Smoke drifted and hissed, curling around his face as sparks spat out in the chaos of combat. To those who saw him, it must have seemed less a man than a demon stepping out of fire, sword glinting in one hand while pistols hung loaded at his chest. His appearance mattered as much as steel. Many crews dropped weapons at the sight alone, hearts broken without a swing of the blade. It is easy to imagine sea battles as long duels of cannon and cutlass, ships blasting each other apart for hours. Most victories, though, came quickly. Pirates valued speed and efficiency. Cannon fire was brutal but costly, powder was limited, and every shot threatened to damage the very cargo they hoped to claim. They only fired enough to unsettle opponents, to create smoke and chaos, or to tear sails and slow an escape. Their true goal was to capture ships intact, board swiftly, end everything before wounds and damage grew too heavy. Victory in these raids was practical. Once in control, pirates looked not for jewels first, but for bread, dried meat, water barrels, or medicines. They searched storerooms for spare canvas, ropes, and tools to maintain their own ship. Food was joy. Water, fresh and clear, felt like treasure itself. Coin mattered, but not as much as supplies that could keep them alive on the next stretch of sea. For lifeboats cramped with hunger, it was often oranges and flour that brought the most cheering. Yet joy from plunder slipped away quickly. Bread became stale in days, water soon turned foul, meat shrank under heat, and sickness returned. A captured treasure chest filled with gold could not cure scurvy. A pouch heavy with silver could not cool fever. Even the grandest captures only delayed misery for a short time. One captain named Condent once seized a haul so extraordinary that coins glittered in piles. But in just a few years, the wealth was gone. Spent quickly, scattered, and traded away. Big hauls were rare and fleeting. Most of the time, trade goods and food carried more worth than coins, and still, it never lasted long. Imagine standing on a deck minutes after a fight. Sails hang tattered, barrels lie open, bread and meat are divided straight away. Men gulp water from jugs as if their throats burn. Laughter rings for a time, relief pouring across weary faces. But days pass, then weeks, and the same cycle closes back in. The food dwindles. The clean water sours. Sickness creeps through the crew. What seemed like lasting fortune shrinks into memory, leaving them once again at the mercy of hunger and thirst. And the dangers of battle lingered even when victory seemed clear. A single injury could weaken not just the wounded man, but the ship itself. Each hand mattered. Rope needed pulling, sails demanded strength, cannons weight. A musket ball to one shoulder, a sword deep into one leg. These injuries robbed the crew of more than one man. They increased the strain on his brothers and turned survival tasks into impossible loads. Blood spill did not only stain the deck, it chained the ship with heavier burdens. Still, fear pressed hardest, not only on merchant sailors, but back upon the pirates themselves. To survive by terror meant being seen as monsters, not men. Kingdoms and empires framed them as devils of the seas, spreading tales to gather support for hunting every last one. The skulls they raised with pride became signs painted against them. The very weapon they wielded best turned back, plain marks that drew navies and patrols across their waters. In the short hours of raids, fear seemed enough. The cycle carried them on for months, even years. One capture, then relief, then hunger, then another risk. But each success made their world collapse a little more. Ports closed their gates, no longer welcoming their stolen trade. Patrols stretched across oceans, hunting ships that had once been free. Slowly the seas shifted against them, and each triumph cost more than the supplies it gained. Picture the rise and fall of morale across weeks. At the start, a roar of cheer after a merchant ship yields. Bellies full, cups raised, men feeling as if survival is safe for once. Then the dwindling. The laughter quiets, rations thin, tension spreads. Soon eyes return to the horizon, searching with hunger instead of joy. What looked like triumph shrinks back to desperation. This was the rhythm written into every pirate's life, plunder giving only temporary relief, then sliding back to hunger as if nothing had changed at all. Even these rhythms faded when faced with stronger opposition. Merchant ships still bent under fear, but warships stood firm. Large, decked with rows of cannon, filled with drilling crews. A navy vessel could not be cowed by a smoke-wreathed beard or a black flag. With every year, more of these dangers filled the seas. Battles did not end in easy boarding. They ended in defeat, capture, and death for crews used only to scaring softer opponents. Pirates found themselves hunted, pressed on open seas, their confidence eroded, and their victories less secure. Fear had carried them farther than any blade could. It won quick battles, it carried small relief. But by its very nature, it could not last. Hunger, disease, injury, and the rising power of the empires closed around them. What once worked so well unraveled beneath harsher winds. For pirates, each victory became smaller, each loss greater, until even their strongest tools could no longer hold the seas open. And so the horizon shifted. Out there lay not just prizes, but powers too vast to intimidate. Step by step, ports closed, patrols widened, and the thin survival terror once purchased faded into cracks. The tide that had carried them forward now began to return the other way, pressing hard against every small triumph. The world beyond their ships was changing, and soon it would sweep away not only their victories, but the very freedom they had fought to preserve. By the early 1730s, the world had shifted beneath the pirates' feet. What had once seemed like a boundless ocean filled with opportunity narrowed into patrol routes, guarded convoys, and watched harbors. This was the decline of the golden age of piracy. The dream of survival built on hunger, boldness, and fragile equality was pressed from every side. Black flags that once scattered merchants now drew warships, their presence no longer a terror, but a signal for pursuit. Colonial powers had turned their full attention back to the seas. England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands no longer allowed outlaw crews to roam with impunity. Patrols expanded. Warships prowled trading lanes with firepower and discipline that ragged pirate crews could not match. Vessels designed for speed and battle cut through the waters where smaller ships once raided unchecked. The same ocean that had seemed endless now held invisible nets, closing port by port, until there were fewer and fewer corners left to hide. By the 1730s, colonial powers had tightened patrols and offered pardons. Nassau's pirate haven was reclaimed under Governor Woodes Rogers. Part of this change came from the power of words as much as weapons. Royal declarations offered pardons to those who would step away from piracy. The Crown issued clemency through the proclamations of 1717 and 1718, opening a path for weary sailors. Give up your arms, and you might be spared. Pardons were not promises of glory, but they carried enough clarity to split the fragile unity of pirate bands. Some men, exhausted by hunger and pursuit, accepted them and walked back into ordinary lives on land or at sea. Others rejected them outright, their refusal marking a defiance that would see them hunted until the end. Crews divided along these choices, tearing apart friendships forged in shared hardship. Few places showed this unraveling so clearly as Nassau in the Bahamas. For a brief and unusual time, Nassau had lived as a kind of pirate republic. Broken naval discipline had been replaced here with new codes, voting for leaders, trading stolen goods, repairing ships, and shaping little communities out of independence. For men used to lashes and orders, it was a fragile kind of freedom. Yet Nassau's moment could not endure. Navy ships anchored nearer. Governors pushed back into its streets. Under Woodes Rogers, pardons were offered, but so was the blunt threat of force. Slowly, step by step, the sound of laughter and defiance on its docks dimmed under the new weight of law. You might imagine being one of the men standing on Nassau's shore as Rogers arrived. His promises of pardon sounded to some like salvation after years of hunger, wounds, and sleepless nights at sea. To others, they were no more than submission, an end to the fairness they had risked their lives for. Crews fractured over those choices. Some vanished into the folds of empire. Others sailed away under the same black banners, now outcasts not only against the crown, but also against former brothers. Beyond Nassau, the broader world was changing as well. Trade networks grew too strong, too disciplined, too heavily protected. Where once convoys were scattered and vulnerable, now they moved in coordinated lines behind military escorts. Capturing one ship meant far less when the heart of trade had shifted to expand beyond their reach. Embedding wealth in structures pirates could no longer easily disrupt. The opportunity space narrowed until even bold raids yielded little beyond the risk of death. Think of the shift from a pirate's perspective. One year, you capture ship after ship, food flowing into your barrels, water clear and fresh, small treasures easing daily pains. The following year, on that same horizon, you glimpse not fleeing merchants but rows of patrol ships, sails taut, guns polished and ready. Hunger feels sharper but opportunities fewer. The same weapon that once set men trembling, your flag, loses its edge. The fear that had belonged to merchants seeps instead into your own deck. And so, where once pirate courage rested on intimidation, by the 1730s they found fear turning back on themselves. Convoys guarded merchants, and naval escorts stood firm where before they panicked. Rumors grew of warships too large to threaten, crews too trained to scare. The confidence that had once fueled swift boarding parties drained into hesitation. For many, each sailing horizon began to look less like chance and more like a trap. The end came not in sudden, spectacular events, but in slow erosion. Men surrendered in ones and twos, sometimes whole ships falling quietly into naval custody. Harbors closed to them, bringing both isolation and hunger. Each capture ended not just with seized supplies, but often with silence, as names faded into prison cells or scattered across pardoned lives. For those who continued to fight, the price grew heavier. Many were captured and executed, others accepted pardons or simply faded away into obscurity. Executions haunted this era, but the truth is more varied than tales of gallows suggest. In some ports, pirates left to hang became lessons for others, their bodies visible warnings pinned against the sky. Yet not all ended there. Some melted into land life without their names carried forward. Others settled into quiet corners of the colonies, their scars a private mark rather than a public display. A few, pardoned and beaten tired by years at sea, returned to work as ordinary seamen, abandoning dreams of freedom for the certainty of survival. Communities that had once felt united under hunger and hardship scattered beneath this pressure. Trust weakened. A man who had once shared your hammock or your hardtack might now drift away under pardon, leaving you to wonder if you would face your own end with fewer allies. These divisions created more damage than storms or sickness ever had. The dream of a collective life bound by code and fairness dissolved under forces greater than any one ship's will. As you reflect on this slow decline, you may notice a quiet sadness in it. These men did not imagine themselves as villains. Many had left harsh naval decks for a sliver of fairness, for wages shared equally, voices heard in choosing leaders. To see that experiment collapse beneath imperial strength was to learn how fragile their fairness truly was. Kings and governors did not lash them with whips, but in reclaiming their ports, cutting off their trade, and splitting their unity with pardons, Those rulers erased the spaces where their equality had held. Even in their final stretch, some clung on. Crews still raised their black flags, still raided supply ships when they could. But their victories shrank to temporary flickers. A barrel of water, a handful of meals, a small bit of cargo. Each act of survival drew more hostile attention. Each success burned shorter than the last, until only sparks remained against the growing shadow of empire. When you imagine the closing days, do not picture buried treasure or men vanishing into legend with smiles. For most, there was no treasure waiting. Their endings were quieter, quieter than stories suggest. Ragged ships fading at sea, bodies worn by sickness, men slipping away into rural towns where their names would never again be spoken. Their freedom, so bold at the start, ended in silence more often than spectacle. The golden age of piracy was short and brittle, its life beating within only a handful of years. It rose from sailors desperate for fairness, survived through fear and camaraderie, and unraveled when confronted with powers too great to resist. Navies, fortified trade networks, and governors carrying pardons made certain that by the 1730s, the fragile ground beneath piracy had folded away. Now allow this picture to rest in your mind. A battered crew lowering their flag, some stepping into pardoned lives, others bound for cells, still others trying hopelessly to carry their freedom into seas now crowded with empire. Their experiment in equality had lived only a moment, pressed thin against hunger and risk until it dissolved beneath the weight of stronger powers. And yet, even as their ships faded from the waves, their shadow lingered. Their names, their flags, their cries of defiance, these carried into memory long after their sails were gone. And so we may ask quietly, if their days were so cruel, if their end was so bitter, why is it that these pirates remain in our dreams even now? If pirate life brought so much hardship, why do we still find it so strangely comforting to think about now? You've listened to the truth of moldy bread, sour water, blistered hands, and punishments none could escape. Yet when we imagine pirates today, the picture softens. In the stories that remain, we hear laughter across a deck, see sails swelling bright in the sun, and feel a current of rebellion in the air. The myth is not about cruelty or hunger. It is about freedom, about a life no ordinary man or woman could claim on land. That's the lasting allure, the part that lingers long after the darkness has faded. You already know that disease and exhaustion filled their real lives, but when memory reshapes them, pirates become more than what they were. Blackbeard is not remembered for gnawing stale biscuits, but for standing, smoke curling in his beard, facing warships without fear. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are remembered not for damp hammocks, where lice crept in the night, but for fighting fiercely in a world that tried to silence them. Their names survive not through misery, but because in legend they stood against expectations, making defiance itself their story. Ordinary hunger and wounds are forgotten, and what remains is a symbol of courage carried into the present. Part of why this image survives is how it brushes so strongly against our daily lives. Today we live amidst schedules, rules, and obligations that measure out each hour. A pirate ship, in memory, feels like a place cut free from all of that. You might close your eyes now and picture yourself at the helm of your own day, each choice your own, the wide ocean responding only to your will. Of course, the truth was harsher than this, but in thought, the idea is gentle. It offers a kind of escape, a reassuring dream of life lived without chains around each moment of time. The most curious part is how their myth preserves two seemingly opposite things at once. They represent danger and order, rebellion and justice. Their flags promised chaos, but their codes promised fairness. A lawless cry paired with written contracts, equal shares, and limits even captains were bound to respect. That mixture calls to us because deep down most of us want both. We yearn for freedom, but also for safety. We want rebellion, but within boundaries that keep us whole. In memory, pirates offer us that impossible balance. They are remembered as living both ways at once, and that is part of their quiet power. Still, it matters to notice the difference between memory and reality. On deck, no one forgot the ache in their teeth or the sting in their skin. No one skipped the long hours hauling ropes or endured fevers with comfort. Very few ever grew old on land again. And yet, their stories turned away from these truths the moment ink touched paper. Sensational books like Captain Charles Johnson's accounts spread widely in the 18th century and gave pirates their larger-than-life image. These tales pruned away the stench and decay and replaced them with bravery, mystery, and adventure. What lived in print was softer, brighter, and more lasting than the experience ever was. Think of it this way. A pirate ship truly held hunger, sickness, and constant danger, yet a story carries forward the single shining idea that freedom can be grasped. That transformation is not rare. History often gives us harsh details, but memory adjusts them, smooths them, and leaves us symbols to hold instead of wounds. In this case, the symbol is rebellion against kings and masters, the possibility of equality carved from nothing. And that is why the allure is not only fascination, it is comfort. Part of the appeal also touches something personal. When you imagine yourself on a pirate deck under their code, you can picture your voice being heard in a way it might not be in daily life. Every man or woman signing the articles had a choice, a vote, and a share. That image is rare in much of the world's past, especially among the poor or dispossessed. Today, remembering it feels soothing. You picture yourself counted as equal, trusted to stand as part of something larger, not silenced. Even if the truth rarely played out so cleanly, the myth preserves it that way. And we long for that picture. That longing explains why the myths hold us so gently. They do not remind us of pain. They heal us from it. We can enjoy the idea of facing down kings and ships without ever needing to taste foul water or feel lashes on our back. Stories give us only the part we need, the strength, the courage, the shared defiance. They screen off the misery, leaving a safe distance where the dream can live separately. We can rest in that dream, knowing the pain belonged to someone else. But the idea of freedom still floats close enough for us to claim a piece. Think of the images most often carried forward from childhood tales. Treasure maps drawn with dotted lines leading to secrets. Ships sailing boldly into squalls, defiant against lightning and wind. The black flag raised as both warning and promise. We now know those maps were inventions. They made their way in later stories, not the truth of hunger and thirst. But they remain, because they give us symbols of discovery. They declare that life still holds mysteries worth chasing. They tell us that beyond our horizon lies something more. Individual figures carry this allure too. Blackbeard endures as mystery and menace, an image of unshakable power. Anne Bonny and Mary Red end as emblems of rebellion, not remembered for hardship, but for facing odds in a world that expected obedience. These names show us that memory chooses meanings, not strict fact. The nameless thousands, those whose lives were swallowed by misery, fade, but the idea of defiance through them stays bright in the few remembered stories. Our minds cling to those brighter parts. Symbol lasts longer than detail. It is worth noticing how myths shape pain into something softer. Each generation retells the stories, not to relive decay and hunger, but to recover dignity and to hold the idea of courage. A man who once shook with fever is instead remembered as a bold figure. A woman who slung rope on wet decks becomes in story a warrior of her own making. The myth does not erase the suffering, it floats above it, transforming what is unbearable into something our minds can cherish. That is how memory helps us rest alongside even dark histories. When told today, these stories often emphasize not only rebellion, but also equality. Pirates become rebels who carried order of their own making. They were not chaos without shape, but voices arranged under rules they signed together. This interpretation soothes us now, because it whispers freedom is not destruction. It can still have form. It can be shared. That idea comforts, because it makes the thought of freedom less frightening. So when you quietly wonder why pirates still matter, look past the flags and cannons. They give us an outline of dignity carved into some of the darkest lives. They show us helpless men trying to mold fairness into the only home they knew. Their stories in retelling let us believe that even in a world filled with lashings and hunger, fragments of equality still bloomed. Memory strips away the decay and holds only this outline. That outline comforts us because it is what we too search for: dignity, choice, and belonging. Let yourself rest with this thought. Pirates endured worlds of scarcity and pain, but what carries forward is choice. The memory of choice grows larger than their misery, turning into a cloud of freedom hovering gently across time. In truth, their hunger gave them no peace. Yet in story, they leave us peace. They remind us that freedom, in some form, can still be claimed, even if only briefly. As you consider this now, imagine a flag still fluttering in memory's wind. The edges are frayed, the canvas worn thin, but the symbol remains. It no longer frightens, it soothes. It whispers of escape, dignity, and courage. The rough edges of truth are smoothed away by time, leaving only the gentle shape of an idea. This is the lasting allure, the way memory softens stories until they soothe us, turning hardship into symbols of freedom. And in that quiet transformation, the past offers us not only knowledge, but rest. So as we hold these stories tonight, let them settle gently around you. They will carry us calmly into one final reflection, where the costs of freedom and the fragile bonds of unity find their place together. Pirates remind us that freedom often came at a heavy cost. Their days were short and difficult, yet even in those harsh hours, they found small ways to create fairness and dignity together. Unity, not comfort, was the quiet thread that held them. As you rest now, let this simple thought stay close. In the midst of chaos, they still found a way to live as equals. If this calm voyage helped you unwind tonight, a soft like or a quiet follow helps me keep these stories coming. Now, close your eyes and let the waves carry you into rest.